have a little over 20 minutes for general discussion for all of the panelists. So, yes, please. Yeah.
Oh, me?
Yes.
I would like to hear from the whole panel about how we bridge these multiple levels. Like, so what are the plausible mechanisms through which something like behavioral engagement in a video game would affect things like inflammation or telomere length or RNA transcription? What are the mechanisms that we can explore to try to make a coherent puzzle out of all of this?
So I think one of the things that comes up is that in Adam's talk is he's seeing the activation of these systems, and it gets back to the use it or lose it. So I think if you have a couch potato, their systems are just declining, and you need to exercise these systems to get those genes that are turned on to maintain this cognitive function.
Yeah, but everything we know about behavioral plasticity, I think neuroplasticity as well, is that we respond very narrowly to the effects of experience. So how is that going to work?
So I haven't done these video games, but I recommend to people that they travel because you run into novelty all the time, and you're always having to deal with this. So it's not a narrow band, and it can transfer to many different things.
Yeah, but that's another hypothesis, right? Maybe we just need to expose ourselves to novelty, in which case any video game is likely to get old. So it's not just use it or lose it. We need to know what we have to use in order to not lose what.
Yeah, well,
go ahead, Adam.
Quick. I'd say a lot of all the things that we create, we're not just making them up out of thin air. We're trying to be driven by other fields of research that allow us to generate stronger hypotheses. So, for example, we have a meditation-inspired game, and meditation, has been shown across many studies to have impact not just on cognition, but also stress and mood, physical fitness as an element in it. So the video game is a delivery mechanism. It's a way of engaging someone in a deep way that's adaptive, that challenges things that they might do in their real lives. And the people that do those things live healthier lives, as we've just discussed. So this is not meant to be a replacement or a type of magic trick. It's just a way of reproducibly delivering things that we already have an understanding have a benefit. But you're right. I mean, there's still hypotheses. So this is the direction that we think has lots of potential. But I think the next decade of trying to show this in a careful, rigorous way is the big challenge.
So, in the second microphone, please. Yeah.
Excuse me. I wanted to point out that in normal, healthy people, correlations between general cognitive ability and brain structure are only in the 0.25 to 0.3 range. So that in the post-mortem studies, it's not surprising that you find a certain amount of mismatch between brain pathology and cognition. And given that, I think the amount of variance you're accounting for is pretty good. I have a question, though, for Dr. White about your finding educational attainment and occupational complexity as the predictors of resilience. People have been talking about those two as environmental exposures. And so first, I just wanted to say I think that it's not a good idea, to think of them as primarily environmental exposures. I think we have to keep in mind that people don't get randomly assigned to how much education they're exposed to or the occupation that they're engaged in. So the question is, you have a lot of data from way back on these people. Have you looked at what predicts educational attainment and cognitive complexity?
I think that's a key issue. The other thing I'd like to say is that when we talk about education, we always use traditionally a number. How many years of schooling did you have? But we all know that what's doing that is not sitting in a chair in a classroom. What we know is that there's something that is related to sitting in a chair in a classroom, in an environment, having something differently done to your mind. And the key issue is, what are those different things done to your mind? My own view basically is that from evolution, We know that the only reason that we're here today is we have redundancy, huge redundancy, for dealing with all challenges. My own view is that what you get in education is you get a redundancy of strategies for addressing different kinds of challenges. So I think and this fits very well with the potential of video games, because what you're doing with video games is, given there is an appetite, which you can use for developing this, I think from watching my own kids play video games, they are learning redundant alternative strategies. And that's related to the cognitive reserve. I really think it's this redundancy of how you approach a problem. Now, all of us who are a little bit older remember the problem of remembering a person's name that you haven't seen for a while. And what we all do is we think, oh my God, I see this person at the last meeting? Did I see him in this? What we're doing is we're going down a system of different kinds of ways of finding a place to categorize. And I think that represents an aspect of cognitive reserve that is related to education. Now, the trick then is, how in the world do you measure the number of exposures which will enrich the development of alternative approaches to problem? Now, it also goes, if you've got an intact corpus callosum, you can have a dialogue between two hemispheres. And if you have something on one side and something on the other side, to do it, you may be able to. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is sinistrality. In Hawaii, everybody we ask if you're left-handed or right-handed, they always say, I'm right-handed, 99%, because they write with their right hand, because they were not allowed to write with their left hand growing up. Do those people, have they had the exposure of being forced to develop a more robust bihemispheric function than others? And would that show up as resilience? I haven't tested it yet. But that's the kind of thing I think we're after. I've thought long and hard. We asked our guys, when you were a schoolboy, how did you do in sports? You start ask sports first because they warm up. Then we eventually get to music and poetry. And as sort of a samurai culture, poetry isn't something that they often will mention that they're interested in, but we ask all of those questions. And we do find that those men who are most willing to say that as a schoolboy, they were interested in puzzles, math, higher math, poetry, and music, seem to do better. I can't think of a better way of going back to childhood and early adult life than doing that. I think the diversity of occupations conceivably offers something like it. This is also related to creativity. To be creative, you have to look at other things. I can't think of many. If anybody has any suggestions to how to address that, would love to hear them.
Please.
Hi. I just have a couple of quick questions. First one is for Tom. In terms of your synaptic markers, specifically the postsynaptic genes, do you see any localization in specific areas of the brain? And number two is for Adam. In terms of the game itself, the design of the game, it's NeuroRacer. So have you considered actually designing a game that would be more, shall we say, palatable to older folks? Because quite frankly, just anecdotally, if my grandmother, who's 90, ever tried to play NeuroRacer, she would throw it in the ocean. So that doesn't mean that she's cognitively impaired. It just means I don't want to deal with it. So those are my two questions. Thanks.
Yeah, we do get differences. In the prefrontal cortex, we're seeing more changes in excitatory, inhibitory interactions. Well, there's lots of structural changes in genes in both.
And have you looked at the hippocampus, like specifically the
Yeah, we actually compared different regions, and we look for the most genes that change, and we call that over age to see which ones are more vulnerable, and that tends to be involved in inflammation, dentate gyrus before CA1, white matter before other regions in terms of inflammation, and there are differences across regions, but what's really nice is they correlate with the cognitive decline that depends upon each of those regions.
Thank you.
So yeah, I would say in our experience, your grandmother would be an outlier in that case. We've had hundreds of older adults into their 90s play NeuroRacer in the much better game that came from it called Evo, and we have 100% compliance across almost all of our studies and have to almost pull the game away at the end of the study. A lot of it is driven by just very innate human desire to get better at things, to be engaged and to see those improvements. And so we spend a lot of time working with our game teams about customizing games to different populations. And what we often find is that it's not as necessary as we thought it was. And especially with older adults, the idea of developing mastery in technology is incredibly enticing and leads to engagement outside of the game mechanics itself. But your point is well taken. We do think a lot about design. For example, if you're going to engage a population that are not young boys, and not use violence, you do need art, music, and story. And so we're constantly bringing these on. They're what mature audiences seek for in their in enjoyment and their recreation. And so with those elements, you can lead to sustainable gameplay in older adults. We've seen that many, many times.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Dockery, please.
Yes, thank you. It may be a little off the track, but we did deal with this in the Institute of Medicine study. Where does wisdom fit in this discussion?
Patricia?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. There is some evidence that as people get older, they use collective experience more to guide decision making. They also tend to focus more on positive aspects of things. So Laura Carstensen has published on this idea of the positivity effect of aging. And I think the thinking is that as people get older, they are better able to sort of corral the resources they've obtained over a lifetime, and their essentially wisdom helps them to navigate decisions and navigate outcomes that they're dealing with as they're aging. Unfortunately, we don't study that well, but I certainly think there are age-related changes in knowledge and the way knowledge is conceptualized and organized in the brain that influence behavior for sure.
Would there be a correlation with the educational level then that would relate to the other studies?
Quite likely. Sometimes these things are not as correlated as we would expect. So you can have wisdom in certain domains or knowledge or life experience in certain domains that aren't driven by education, but I would imagine that there would be an association with education and other things like literacy, related constructs, I would think.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Hi. I took the concept of this panel to be around validation of these measures of brain reserve for clinical trials that might seek to manipulate brain reserve. And I wonder if people on the panel can kind of help me connect the dots between the measures we heard about, which often involve, pathology, for example. Real measures of brain pathology typically expresses a different score to cognitive function. How we might think about using those kinds of measures in the clinical trials that we're doing at Posit Science, that Adam talked about doing, that people who are involved in physical fitness training, for example, might do. Do we see a path where those really become endpoints that we're seeking to manipulate in classic randomized controlled trials? Can we connect those things?
Okay, I saw that as well, and I'm wondering what validation was. The difficulty is, of course, is the first thought in validation actually is using the data that goes into what we're calling attributable to reserve or resilience. So you can't really validate outside that circle. I am fortunate in having available the data from the Nun study, and the pathology and a lot of the other things we've done were very similar. So the closest that, with resilience index that I described, I can come to approaching validation is to see if things behave the same way. That doesn't truly mean we're validating this wonderful concept of reserve or resilience, but it's the closest I can see so far to a validation. It just doesn't work in other populations.
Yeah, and maybe I expressed my question a little bit more clearly this way. Let's say that validated measure comes out of your work or that of your colleagues. Can we anticipate that those measures might be useful to those of us doing randomized controlled trials of interventions? Or the measures of resilience we're coming up with, are these going to be just not appropriate for RCTs in various different ways?
I think we're at an impasse in research right now because the neuropathologic research that's coming out says we're kidding ourselves if we think that all dementia is really Alzheimer's. It's truly not. And not only is it not Alzheimer's, it's not any single disease. It's the problem that when you get old, Murphy's Law cuts in and you start getting all kinds of different things. And people who at 85 are getting demented are always a mixture of things. We cannot measure those things with existing tools during life. I don't think we'll solve the problem until we figure out how to bring together everything that we can see with neuroimaging and biomarkers precisely with what we can measure by neuropathology. So there needs to be a series of intermediate studies which may take 10 years, where we really look at all the neuroimaging stuff creatively and all the biomarker stuff, and then do the autopsies. And it'll have to take a lot of people who die and give their brains in a short period of time. That's a daunting undertaking, but I don't think we're going to be able to get where you want to be until that research is done.
Patricia, do you have?
Generally, I agree with what Lon said. Yeah, I think trying to define resilience in living people in whom we have limited information about what's actually going on in their brain is really tough if you conceptualize resilience the way we do, which is the ability to function well above and beyond all the bad stuff that we know people get as they get older. So agree. I mean, we actually are engaged in some clinical pathologic studies right now where we are trying to use in vivo imaging to develop biomarkers of neuropathologies in the brain that currently can't be measured in vivo. So trying to see if we can use DTI, fMRI, structural imaging to kind of say, what are the signals here we see that actually map on to hippocampal sclerosis, TDP, whatever. And it's possible that from those studies we will be able to get a biomarker we can use during life that has some predictive capability. But I agree, until we get there, it's going to be really hard to, with any degree of precision, identify resilient individuals.
Okay, it looks like we have time for the last two questions. Yes,
Hi,
please.
thank you for a really wonderful discussion that introduces novel methodologies. And I'd like to build on some work we've been doing that demonstrates that meaningful social engagement promotes neurocognitive plasticity in aging adults using both fMRI and volumetric MRI. And so the challenge becomes, the challenge and the opportunity really becomes one to ask, how do we take these findings in the real world and think about both animal and human models using mobile health and technology to try to mimic, and ask you as a panel to think about we've talked about physical engagement and we've talked about cognitive engagement, but to think about whether there's a unique opportunity to think about how social engagement may stimulate neurocognitive plasticities either in an additive or a synergistic way, and how do we capture that with the methodologies you've introduced today?
Tom, why don't you give us the animal models?
So we know that if we keep animals in a single cage, they always perform worse than animals that are pair housed or group housed. Mm-hmm. It's just very consistent. So if you really want to see a memory impairment, single house them.
Patricia?
I think that work is very interesting and promising. We also have shown that social networks modify the relationship of pathology with cognition, such that having a bigger social network is protective against cognitive decline in the face of accumulating disease. And I absolutely think those types of interventions at a public health level actually do have a lot of potential to have an impact on cognitive decline. I think that's where we're going. in saying that there are some behavioral and experiential factors that actually are modifiable if we can figure out how to deliver these at a larger level. They have psychological benefits, clear psychological benefits to things like social engagement, enhancing purpose, those types of things, as well as probably cognitive benefits and other health benefits. There is some work being done now by Vic Stretcher, who is at Michigan, where he's developed an app to try to increase purpose in life by helping people set goals. And one of the goals, I'm not intimately involved with this, but one of the goals he has as a part of this thing is social engagement. So interacting with someone that you like, it has to be positive engagement, right? So negative interactions we know are harmful. So interacting with someone you want to be with a certain number of times a week, those kinds of things. And certainly there have been behavioral interventions that do help older adults get out in the community. Experience Corps is a great example of that type of thing, where they engage older adults to be volunteers in schools, underserved schools. So they help kids do reading and other activities. And what happens is these people become friends with each other. And then they go out and socialize and play cards. And they develop a purpose in life because they're helping a kid that actually needs their help. And this is an activity that's really important for these older people. So I think there are ways of doing it. I'm not an interventionist, obviously, but I think that that's a very promising avenue, and it's something that's likely to have high impact if we could
Adam,
do it.
I think you have.
I'll just say one sentence.
Yeah.
You know, I think there's great potential and also challenge in the world of technology, mobile communication, social, online networks, as well as multiplayer video games. I mean, it's part of the future. We could, deny it, but, as we also know, young people become older people too, and they're using these tools already. So I think there's fascinating research questions about how do you leverage that technology that people are going to use anyway for positive social interactions with the outcomes you're talking about.
One very quick.
Yeah, I'd just like to go back to the question of wisdom and knowledge. And one thing we know is associated with educational attainment, which has been a good proxy in almost all accounts for resilience, is that it leads to knowledge, and that's crystallized intelligence. And I just wonder about the extent to which we can really find a way to increase fluid intelligence in terms of memory, attention switching, that sort of thing, or whether we should be looking for ways in which people draw on their crystallized intelligence, their knowledge of language, and things like that.
That's $1 million question, right? If we could increase intelligence, we'd have a major impact. There have been trends. Intelligence has increased over the decades. And one thought is that is due to exposure to multiple resources. So internet use, for example. People are exposed now to a wealth of information that, previously you had to go to the library, deal with a, card and find your book, and you couldn't get the kind of information you can get now. And the ability to travel around, see different places, and have novel experiences. In terms of an intervention to actually make a significant improvement, that's over decades, what I'm talking about. These changes have been over decades.
Thanks.
I have to stop.
Okay.
Me too.
Thanks to all of the panel members, and thanks to the audience for their participation. It's been a wonderful session.